resources to create new environmental practices. So that's the focus of what our study is about. And we'll explain all of these terms next. So if you don't remember them yet. So I want to talk about three things today. The first one is just to explain some of the key terms and theories of our study. Then secondly, I will talk about the methods of the study and the findings. The methods I think might be interesting, particularly to some students who are thinking about different methods of doing research and wanting to know how they might do it. And then a couple of implications about doing research about religion and ecology and social change in Indonesia and beyond. So let's start with key terms and theories. So how can we study individuals and institutions that promote environmental change? Sometimes we want to focus on one institution. What does Nahdlatul Ulama do about ecology? What does Muhammadiyah do about ecology? Or we want to focus on a particular individual, like what does Greta Thunberg do about ecology? So one way that we can study individuals and institutions, not the only way, but the way that we're using in this study is focusing on social movements as the individuals and institutions that encourage change to happen in the environment with the crises that we experience. So we're looking at social movements not as just Greenpeace or WALHI or some other NGO, although they are some actors, not only as like the Muhammadiyah Green, the Green Muhammadiyah organization that some students are studying. What are they called? Yeah, Iman Pramod, but Kada Hijau Muhammadiyah. Yeah. So, yeah. So not looking just at the institution, but looking more broadly at any networks of people and organizations who are engaged in collective action in the pursuit of environmental benefits. So that could be one person who wants to encourage their neighbors to recycle waste. It could be a massive movement like the Kendong or the Sedulur Sikap movement against mining. That includes thousands of people and many organizations. So it's thinking very broad and can be quite narrow as well. But it includes also movements for environmental justice, like in Kendong, and also people trying to change behavior in local communities or in religious institutions, or even just with their neighbors. Yeah, so that's what we mean by social movements. What do we mean about how we can study this process of environmental change and creativity? And for that, I mean that we're not trying to say who is good at it, who is bad at it, who is making a difference. We're saying, how does environmental change happen? And one interesting way to study the process is to focus on local communities. And this is because local contexts shape how movements adopt different strategies and messages, including religious ones. So why, for example, if we want to stop logging in Kalimantan, why would we in one case use a legal case and in another case use a fatwa? Why use a fatwa or why use a legal case, right? It's the way to focus it is on what's happening in the local community that's encouraging this approach and that's influencing the approach. Because often there's a question, how many fatwas are there now about the environment in Indonesia, do you think? If you had, anyone could guess how many, I don't know, but let's guess. How many fatwas about the environment, just from MUI, for example, from the national organization? Just a little. Do you think, is it just a little? Anyone else have how many fatwas about the environment? At least there's at least 10. Probably, I think there's about 50, maybe. There's a lot. But the question people ask is, well, what difference does it make when you have a fatwa? What difference does it make if a religious leader says not to do something or do something? So studying local communities helps us to know how the movements adopt strategies. It also looks at how they can connect different narratives, how they can help convince people who are from different religious groups, people who are, let's say, farmers or fishers, people to kind of join this. And this is what we call a bridging narrative, and also the idea of a collective action frame, which is how you can take many different narratives and make them together into one message. For example, stop mining in the Kendong Mountains. So this is the message, but the message can include, there could be an Adat message, a Muslim message, Christian message, a legal message, a feminist message. So how the different messages get included. The third aspect is, how do we study religion and ecology in practice rather than in theory? So in our case, we want to focus on Indonesia. And we're thinking about specifically Indonesia, as you all know, as being a front line for environmental crises, where there are hundreds of active environmental movements. Actually, we found more than 1,000 just in our initial search. So there's so many. There's many more than 1,000. And as you know, also there's a lot of religious diversity, different religious communities, religious practice can be quite varied. So it's a good place to study the context. And then the important aspect that we'll come back to today is how can we study religion without essentializing it or marginalizing it? Because a challenge we have as sociologists or scholars or experts of any kind is that we have to start with the question, as we know in CRCS, how do you define religion? What is religion? And once you make a definition, then you say something is not religion. So this ritual is religious, this ritual is cultural, this ritual is not connected to anything. So it's this process of how we categorize it. So we're trying to use an approach called lived religion that some of you have heard about. And the idea of lived religion is that you try not to focus on how governments or institutions define religion, the official version, and also not to focus on how experts define religion. So religious leaders, academics. So we don't start with their definition. We start with the focus on local and daily practices. So what do people do in their religious practice? And when they're doing their religious practice, does it include different elements? And sometimes at the local level, it's hard to say. Is something local wisdom or religion or adat or all these categories? So we're trying to look at it and start with what people are doing and include all of that, and then see what the interaction is between it, what's happening in that space. So what was the study then? We tried to learn from existing data about social movements. So many of the people in this room have done research collecting new data. And there's so much data out there that's really interesting, really great sociological studies, anthropological studies. So we thought, is there a way we can try to learn from this data to bring together the data that's been already made in order to get a useful and intelligible conceptual model about how religion responds to environmental change? So what can we learn from studies in Java, Maluku, Papua, Sumatra, that may give us some understanding about how the environment works in practice? I can go into more detail about the methods, but I won't do it today because I want to talk more about the results. But if you want to know more, we can talk about it. But I want to just mention that the key aspect to focus on is the big question in all our data collection, both in our primary research when we do field work and in secondary, is about bias. What about bias? So if I, for example, if I get some data from Rybka's study or Masadam's study, I don't know like how they collected the data. I don't know what their idea was when they were writing it. So how can we know that this data is good data? I mean, of course, I trust Rybka and Masadam, so I know it's fine. But as a researcher, what do we do about bias? So we found three kind of issues to do with bias. One is that sometimes some of the sources we read were written by activists, you know, and the activists, maybe we can say they may have an agenda. Is it true? Maybe they have their own approach. They have their own issue they want to focus on. So this can be an issue because they want to support the social movement. A second issue is some movements may sources may overvalue the influence or the impact of the social movement. So because they want to study the social movement, they want to just say, oh, this social movement happened and it was the most amazing movement ever. It changed the world. Everything was amazing, but maybe that's not accurate. Also, some sources are about religious movements. And so they often may think that religion is more important than it is because they want to focus on religious movements. So for example, there's a really good study that we use that's about the resistance to manganese mining in Flores in Mangarai province. And the article is really interesting, very good, high quality research. But if you read the article, the conclusion you make is that the Catholic Church is 100% supporting the social movement, 100% behind the social movement. But in reality, the Catholic Church is split. Some people in the church support the movement. Some people in the church oppose the movement, including some of the bishops and the leaders. So there's a problem always we can get into with bias, that we just take the data and don't like consider there may be more out there than the data that exists. So what we tried to do to deal with these issues of bias is to focus on the process instead of focusing on the impact. So in other words, we're not trying to say if you use religion in this way, it's successful. If you use religion in this way, it doesn't work. It's not trying to judge the effectiveness of the movement. Instead, we're trying to understand the process of why religion is used, how it's used. So and studying this process over time as things change. So what did we find? So from our process of finding sources and evaluating sources, we ended up with 244, then I was wrong, 244 studies in English and Indonesian, and half were in Indonesian and approximately half in Indonesian and half in English, which I was very grateful to Mas Adam to help me because my Indonesian was not good enough to analyze all of that data. But we had, so 244, about 208 movements in all 37 provinces of Indonesia between the years 1990 and 2022. So for approximately 32 years? Yeah, no, yes, 32 years. And as you may know, that the Indonesian government just added 3 new provinces this year. So we also had to adjust that quickly, because now Papua now has 5 provinces, right? Whereas before it only had 3. So, or 2, sorry, it only had 2 before, now it has 5. So so in the data we have about between 1 and 33 movements in each province. You can probably guess which province had 33, turning by the data. You can tell by the most red area. So East Java had the most, and there were many more in Java and Sumatra had the most studies. This is because a lot of the researchers, as you know, tend to focus on Java in their research. So this always is an issue that we face, but we did manage to find some across all the provinces, which helped. And we tried to focus on movements that that involve multiple environmental issues. So not just one issue, but including adapting to climate change around flooding, droughts, sea level rise, lack of pollution or pollution or lack of fishing, lack of fish in water, and land waste and water management. So how forests are managed, how peatlands and mangroves are managed, how water is managed and taken care of. Mining and industrial pollution, which is a big issue in Indonesia, as I know a lot of you have studied about. Biodiversity and conservation, so protecting wildlife in forests in particular and coastlines, and environmental awareness. So also some movements that they're not actually doing anything, they're just trying to change people's minds. And we thought this is also interesting to include, right? Because you want to also see what ways do people use religion to try to change people's awareness, raise awareness, change their minds about things. And we managed to find information from all 6 official religions in Indonesia, as well as other aspects of lived religion, which we will talk about. Okay, you're ready for some findings. I've done a lot of background, so let's talk about some findings. So first, we looked at this idea called religious creativity. So religious creativity was a concept that was first written about by Willis Jenkins, who is a religion and ecology scholar in Virginia. And it's based on the idea that the role of religion and how communities respond to environmental crisis is ambivalent. By ambivalent, we mean not good or bad. So this is, unfortunately, I can't answer the question, is religion destroying or saving the planet? You can see a lot of different responses at the same time. One response that our study focuses on is what we call religious creativity, which means inventing new ways of living by reframing and adapting beliefs to address environmental challenges. So it's taking the beliefs that exist, the ideas that exist in society, and trying to reinvent them, recreate them, and to address the environment or the ecology of our world as it changes. So based on the data that we collected and read, we developed this sort of model of how religious creativity can work and is working in practice in the data that we found in Indonesia. And the process, as we were saying there, it involves, give you a little, I use my laser pointer. Yeah, look at that. The process is using what exists to make new concepts and actions. And I'll explain all of this as we go through the findings, but it's saying taking the resources that exist in society and trying to make new environmental beliefs, new environmental practices. And this process is influenced by the contexts in the specific community where the movement is working. It's influenced by the content. So which concepts, practices, rituals, and systems and traditions are available in that context. So in Java, it's different than in Lombok, but also in Yogyakarta, it's different between Bantul and Gunung Kidul. It's different, right? So the available resources depend very much on the local area. Then this process is shaped by the type of strategies that the movement uses, the tactics and strategies that they use to try to promote themselves. And very importantly, it's influenced also by the participation. To what extent are they working together in the movement with local communities and with different people in local communities? And that's what we'll look at now. So the first finding about lived religious resources, there was so we found three categories of what we wanted to call lived religion, which, and I wanted to say importantly that this what we found, this is not something that Adam and I and Masanchu sat down and decided before. We looked what was in the data and then we said, okay, what do we find here? And we found these three categories. It's important to say these are used to identify connections. So we're not saying that there is a clear difference between, for example, Christian practice and local wisdom, or Islamic practice and adat in some ways. We're just saying these are some categories we can include. One is, daily religious beliefs and practices of the official religions of Indonesia, which until recently didn't include indigenous religions, right? In the past, it was not including them. Secondly, the systems and values of local communities connected to distinct locations. So by this, we mean sistem dan nilai masyarakat adat. So we're not talking about adat like a general concept, but like when you have, for example, Amatoa people in Sulawesi, their beliefs and their systems are connected to a specific part of land. It's not all of Indonesia, it's connected to land. So they have specific beliefs about the forest that they want to protect and live in. So it's speaking about these specific groups and the beliefs and practices they have. And then this whole area of local. We found so many studies that are always talking about kearifan lokal, kepercayaan lokal, tradisi. So what does, and it's interesting that different studies will use this in different ways, but this is a really important aspect that's used. Is it culture? Is it religion? Is it something else? We don't know, but it's something that is used a lot in the social movements. So looking in the study, we found actually 571 examples in the data that we found. It's a very long spreadsheet if you want to if you want to read it. You probably don't, but it took us a while to find it. So this includes concepts like this concept of stewardship in Christianity, the concept of Fangshen in Buddhism, the concept of Kejufuli in Confucianism, which means restraining yourself from consuming too much. So there's all these concepts which movements use, different practices, which a lot of you know about, like Selamatan, Sedekah Sampa, which is an interesting practice which blends Islamic ideas with, recycling and taking care of waste. Istigosa, these kind of practices which are used, Pengajian, that are used by movements to help mobilize people to join demonstrations, to support tree planting initiatives, and then rituals, which I'll talk about some of them shortly, and also systems. So systems like adat systems for managing forests or coastlines, like SASI, the system that Rivka talks about in Maluku and Papua. So these kind of systems, and we found a lot of them, as you can see. But what's interesting in our study is how do movements use these resources? So what we found is that when the social movements find all this material, sumber daya, these like resources in the culture and in religion and society, they use them by making connections. So they connect these different concepts with ecological, economic, legal, scientific, other concepts. And they also connect like traditional systems with new legal systems. So like legal, national Indonesian law systems, and try to connect like adat law, customary law with national law. So there's this interesting kind of process of connecting. And what happens is what we call a dynamic process of improvisational synthesis, in the sense that by improvisation, it's like when musicians play together with no music in front of them. They just sit to play and they listen to each other and they start to create something. And this is what we were finding in the data, that they were just taking these resources, mixing them together, and they come up with these really interesting new concepts and actions. And they connect environmental values and cultural and religious and other values together. So what's interesting about the data is that of the 208 movements that we found, 167 of them had some content from one of these categories, either local wisdom, religion, or adat, Masyarakat Adat. But not only that a lot of them used religion, but that there was a really high amount of synthesis between the different types of lived religion. And I think this is important because often when we want to study ecology and society, we start with a definition. So for example, we want to study Christian or Muslim approaches to dealing with the environment, or we want to study the Adat, Masyarakat Adat in Bromo, the Tengger, yeah. We want to study something that's very specific, or we want to study local wisdom in fishing in Islam Pesisir and Islamic fisher communities who live in southern Java. But what we found in the data is interesting is that most of these movements are mixing between all of them. So maybe they have local wisdom, but also they have some religion. Also, they have some adat concepts. And there's a whole high amount of synthesis between these categories. And some of this synthesis is about building on existing systems that already exist in lived religion. So for example, I think you're ready for an example now after all of the long description. In Central Java, in the village of Kalimanggis, which is close to Temanggung, the Temanggung area, there's a Javanese Buddhist community and a Javanese, mostly Muslim community who live in the same village. And they have an annual ritual, Niadran Kali, which is about going to the river, making offerings, but also involves cleaning the river, cleaning the springs and water resources. And what was interesting in this community, the Buddhist community decided that they could adopt the Niadran Kali as a Buddhist practice. So not only as a Javanese practice, but also as a Buddhist practice, because as we know, these rituals like Niadran, they didn't just get invented last year, right? They built over hundreds of years and go back to the time when Indonesia had a lot more influences of Buddhism and Hinduism. So they decided to adopt this ritual of Niadran as a Buddhist ritual and as a part of Buddhist practice. And then they used the ritual as a way to promote taking care of the river and making sure that no pollution or waste went into the river and cleaning it year round. So it became a ritual that was to promote environmental awareness in the village, and that also brought the Buddhist and Muslim, Christian, other communities together to support the river. So this is building on synthesis that already exists in the religion. Is Niadran a Javanese ritual? Is it a Muslim ritual? Is it a Buddhist ritual? This is, yeah. So it's something already there that you can build on. A second one is about traditional systems that are already a synthesis between material and non-material influences. So what I mean by that, if we think about the Minangkabau region and people in West Sumatra, there is a system of a historical synthesis in Minangkabau, as some of you I know CRCS have written about, between Islamic law and between Minangkabau law and traditions. And they actually have this expression, which I always forget, so I have to look. Oh yes, Adat Basandi Sharia, Sharia Basandi Kitab Allah. So the idea, roughly translated, apologies if I messed this up, that the Islamic law, the Sharia, the way of living in Islam, should also connect with the Minangkabau traditions, and there can be a synthesis between them. Now, this kind of synthesis might not necessarily be the most welcoming and inclusive to all religions, that's a debate. But in terms of the connection between Adat communities and Muslim communities, it creates a really strong resource to build upon. So some of people like you probably know Fakhruddin Mangunjaya in Sumatra, and other people created a project where they tried to connect between Islamic concepts about the forest and Minangkabau Adat law about the forest, and tried to synthesize and mix them together. So this means designating areas of the forest as hima, so protected land in Islam, but also using Adat concepts like that you can't, certain times you can't go into the forest, and that the forest, only certain amounts of trees can be cut at certain times. So they synthesized and mixed the two systems together to create a system that was useful both from a religious Islamic perspective and from an Adat perspective. So this is what I mean by synthesizing systems. Also, there are movements that try to connect many groups and interests together into one kind of frame, like the Kendung movement. But considering the time, I'll move on to another type of synthesis that we talk about. The second type of synthesis is about synthesis between religious concepts and other concepts and ideas. So all the movements we studied used environmental concepts because that was the requirement for the study. They had to be using environmental concepts. But 106 of the movements also combined religious concepts with other concepts, such as economic, legal, or scientific concepts. And there was a high amount of synthesis between these concepts. To give you an example, there are two cases in Java that involve Kiai, who are, as many of you know, Islamic or Muslim religious leaders who are very influential in society in Java particularly, and other places, particularly in Java. In one case in Banten in East Java, Kiai there joined a movement and gave support to a movement against a water bottling plant that was being established in Banten. I can tell you the area, sorry, I have to write it down. Paneglang in Banten. There was a water bottling plant, wanted to take a certain amount of land and use the water for developing water bottling. Some of the land they wanted to take also happened to have some makam of saints, and also had some sacred springs, some sendang that were used by some Javanese and some, or Sudanese and some Muslims. So the Kiai joined the movement against the water bottling plant as a kind of capitalist expropriation of religious and local land. So it was a kind of a very strong anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal kind of stance. However, in another location in Central Java, this was in East Java, Lamongan, East Java. There's a pesantren who is an eco-pesantren, and in the eco-pesantren, he tried to blend between ecological ideas and economic ideas. And he had a vision. His name is Kiai Gofor. And he heard his pesantren is called Sunan Derajat Pesantren, which is named after the saints in history in Indonesia. And he said he had a vision of the saints, who is also his ancestor. And the saint told him that the Kemiri Sunan tree is important to the future of the pesantren, and it's a future source of energy. And that's this tree here, which is the candlenut tree. So this tree became the symbol of the pesantren, and they started to plant it everywhere in the pesantren and everywhere in the surrounding community. And they used the candlenut for selling. They can sell it, but also they use it for fuel to run generators, to run other kind of power sources. So it's become a real source of economic development for the pesantren. So in this way, what we see is a fusion between, maybe we could say, economic or neoliberal ideas of development with the environmental movement. So the environment is going together with this approach. And in both of these cases, we're talking about PI in Java, but they're fusing different ideas of economics with ideas of religion together in how they promote the environment. One other one that I think you all might find interesting, because it was a famous case in Indonesia. You remember the Mandalika GP earlier this year, the motocross race in Lombok? So there was, for those of you who don't know, there was the first international motocross GP held at a new track that was just built in Lombok. And on the track, on the day of the race, there was very heavy rain. It's very, very heavy rain. And this stopped the race. So they decided to bring out a pawang hujan, or a rainmaker, to come and try to stop the rain. And this became a big controversy. I saw a lot of tweets about, there's a lot of this on Twitter and a lot of the news, is Indonesia a developed country or not? Do we still bring out like traditional leaders to stop rain, like someone, this person is going to stop the rain, and other people saying, yeah, but this is, we're showing Indonesia to the world. We're showing why Indonesia is different, what we have to contribute to society, ways of looking at nature that are not just look at the weather forecasts, use science. We can, so this creates the idea that there is a conflict, right? You have to either choose. Do you believe in a rainmaker, or do you believe in a scientist? And you're forced into a division. But at the same time, in Lombok, there is a project going on for agrometeorological farming. So this is a system of farming that tries to integrate traditional methods of farming that have been used, as we know in Java, have been used for hundreds of years, traditional methods for farming with scientific methods of farming, in order to adapt to the changing climate. Because as the climate changes, the old ways of dealing with rainfall don't work anymore. So the systems are not effective when climate changes. So in this one, they actually used rituals, like traditional rituals, and they used pawang hujan, rainmakers, and scientists together to try to help create the system and to try to implement the system. So the scientists go out and they check the weather and they suggest this is a good time to plant, and the pawang hujan or the rainmaker goes out and does the ritual, and they do it together. So this is another way of synthesis. Is there, division or a synthesis? I'm going to briefly say, can I go till 5 more minutes? Is okay, or should I? Okay, I think 5 more minutes I'll be. So the third finding, which is also very interesting, and I think for CRCS and others very relevant, is about the context. So why do movements use religion or lived religion in some cases and not in others? Why do we see some places religion seems to be very useful, and in other places it seems less useful? So in our study, 167 of the movements use some lived religion, but it also means 41 did not. It doesn't mean they didn't use it, but we couldn't find any data that talked about anything from our categories of lived religion. So in our study, we collected factors that influenced the movement to try to choose a religious response. So what made them want to use something to connect to religion? And the 4 factors we found were sacred land or resources being threatened or damaged, having the religious identity either threatened or incentivized by the state. So for example, if you can claim land based on a Masyarakat Adat claim, you can receive recognition from the government to manage the land. So this is an incentive for people to promote their connection as being Masharikat Adat. Because if you say that, this can help you to, to have this is an example of the incentivized by the state. The third one, influence of religious leadership and trust in religious leaders. So this is like the kiai in the demonstration, or the different leaders who are involved in supporting movements. So religious leaders have trust in society. So this means you want to get them on your side, if you want to be successful. And the fourth one is traditional practices or systems being disrupted by development, ecological degradation and imposed environmental policies. So when a traditional system, let's say to protect a forest, is disrupted, some people will respond by saying, oh, the system is not good anymore, we should forget about it. But other people will say, we need to revive the system, we need to improve the system, we need to develop the system. So that's what we see in a lot of the cases. And to give you one example, in Bali, some of you know about Tanah Lot Temple. In fact, I think I saw a picture in the office of CRCS. There's a trip that was made to Bali with a picture of people at Tanah Lot. Is that right, Masanchu? Yeah, there's it. So this is one of the famous temples in Bali, and there were many different, over a period of 20 years, many people who wanted to take the land next to the temple and use it for hotels, golf courses, all kinds of plans. And as you know, in Bali, the land is very difficult to protect from tourism, right? If you've been to Bali, you know that if there's any rice field, someone will find a way to put something on top of it, yeah? Or if there's any coastline, someone will find a way to develop it. But in this case, people were so angry about the idea that the sacredness of the temple was being broached by having a hotel right on top of it. The hotel would actually be looking down on the temple, which is in the tradition in Bali and Hinduism is very disrespectful, because the temple should have a space around it that it's not obstructed. This was actually really important to mobilize people continually to join movements, including Hindu leaders, both in Bali and other places, including the Desa Adat in Bali, which are kind of a mixture of Hinduism and Adat traditions, that all kind of joined this movement together and managed to stop the development multiple times. And they still keep trying, so maybe they'll have to stop it again. But in the end, about 2015, they actually made a law where they incorporated the Hindu zoning laws around temples into the Balinese planning code for laws. So now, at least legally, if you want to build a hotel, if it's within three kilometers or in some view of a temple, you're automatically not allowed to, regardless of whatever money you can pay to someone or other techniques you can use. Now, that may not work because legal laws don't always work, but this is an interesting way about the religious kind of idea of sacred land being threatened, help to mobilize people to protect it. The fourth and most important, a really interesting finding, let's say, for all of you in CRCS and others is about the contestation. So the question we had to ask ourselves, we found 571 examples of different types of religion and culture used by movements. We found movements who are using so many different creative ways. Why are they creative? Like, why are they doing so much of this? Are they bored? Are they're just really creative people? Well, one of the main factors we found is that there's a high amount of contestation and change happening in local communities. So what happens is that in every local community, you have people who are supporting the movement, people who are opposing the movement. And within religious groups, you have religious leaders who are supporting the movement and opposing the movement in the same religion. You have local leaders who are supporting and opposing. Also in Adat communities, you have leaders who are supporting and opposing. And also this changes over time. Pat Garrett actually has a really interesting study about this in Malang, about a church close to Malang in Java, who in the past, they promoted destroying the mangrove because they believed the mangrove was connecting people's beliefs to Javanese tradition, to Kejawan, and this was bad. So they said, if we destroy the mangrove, we will break people's connection to Javanese traditions and they will accept Christianity. Now, people from the same church are replanting the mangrove, restoring the mangrove, and trying to revive some Javanese traditions around respecting and connecting to the mangrove. So this shows there's a lot of change over time, a lot of contestation. So this means that the way people participate in movements, the quality of participation and who is involved, and the power dynamics in society really shape how movements work and how they adapt and how they change. So basically, the movements have to keep being creative because otherwise they lose relevance, they lose power. So they have to keep thinking, okay, we've included this Adat community, how can we include the Muslim community? Okay, we included the Muslim community, how can we include scientists? Okay, we included scientists, how can we include labor unions? So they have to keep thinking of new creative ways to try to include people and to adapt to them. And the example of that, which a lot of you know, is about Molo in East Timor, the Molo, not East Timor, sorry, in Timor, not East Timor, West Timor or Timor, the Molo mining case, where I'll just mention one aspect from the case. It's so interesting, is that some of the main resistance to the mining was from the Masyarikat Adat community, but the main people supporting the mining were also from the Masyarikat Adat community. And the mine actually encouraged people from the Adat community to do a ritual on the area of mountain that was considered sacred to call the land unsacred, desacralize the land. So the people supporting the mine used an Adat ritual to make the land available for mining. Then another group came and they resacralized the land. So they said, no, this land is sacred, so we can't mine here. So this amount of contestation is really driving creativity for people to try to keep relevant. I'll just close with one last thing that I want to encourage. What I've learned in this, and I hope can be useful to some of you, is that we can try to study the connections between religion, culture, and environmental practices so that we can better understand how different worldviews and different forms of knowledge interact. And I know a lot of you are studying about Adat communities, about indigenous religions, about there's a conference about indigenous religions next week. It's going to be very excellent. That's being organized by CRCS. In order to understand how these groups are able to gain power or how they lose power, it's important to study what the connections are between them and society, and not in a romantic way, but in a realistic way. What barriers do they face? What challenges do they face if they want to be able to maintain their tradition in a rapidly changing world? So I think this is something we can study, and maybe lived religion as a way to study that, not to try to separate between Masyarikat Adat and local wisdom and religion, but try to see where the connections are between these areas as sociologists. And lastly, that we can use ways to review data that exists to try to find new findings about what's actually happening in Indonesia, because our theories in academia, I can say as coming from the West, coming from the UK, our theories about religion are very broken, very ineffective, very colonial, and we can't change these until we get new theories. And the theories can come from you, and they should come from you. So I want to encourage you to help us find new understanding about what's happening in Indonesia to help us create more useful, better theories about how religion actually works in society in a way that can benefit all of us. So with that, thank you very much.
Okay, that is a very interesting presentation from Jonathan, and I do really like the terms of religious creativity. There's quite new for me, and of course, how to try to explore the religious community because I'm connected to one line and create a separateness of it, and to make a creative ways to preserve the environment. Okay, first 2 questions, please. Two more. One more. Okay, I mean, in the second session of the Q&A, the last question is going to be for. Okay, so
Good.
First, I want to forward the questions from Habib Zaid.
Oh yeah.
So, sorry, the microphone. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
There's a question from Hassan.
Yeah.
Because it's recorded. First, your first finding is about 100 access 67 movements installation.
Yeah.
41 is not. You also mentioned in the beginning, you explain about studying process of change over time, where region is used and how the region is used. This sounds like an instrumentalist look at the relation between religion and social. Is that deliberate? Is that what you see instrumentalization of religions? That's the question for Hassan. And my questions. Actually, it's a simple one. I mean, like, I never did like what you did, but in very small area. And I ever studied about the change, the title analysis in Xiao Xiao. So you doing observation. I just a little bit. So, and I see the change, the shifting paradigm before 2010 and after 2010. So before 2010, usually the thesis use the word Islam and local culture, and after the 2010, they use the indigenous religion.
Yeah.
So there's a shifting.
Right.
And you conduct a research for 32 years, and most of people here are not live for that long until now. So I wonder like how you to see the shifting between each decade and how is there any milestone that change the trajectory or the dynamics between each decade? Because I think the trend is actually different before the
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the presentations, and I'm very happy to be here. My name is German, and I'm going, actually it's my second time to present here. And regarding on your presentations on the how local wisdom about the invasion starting discourse on the environmental change. I have like questions on how is about the body, right? That they pattern to respond the environment change by the solutions, like they isolate themselves or other society. So do you think that the pattern of the isolation is the great things that they can do for the society? And the second question is that you mentioned about revivaling of the Christian community in Iraq, right? So do you think the ideologies of Christian place influenced by conservatism or the sort of stuff that they're constructing their belief to nature rather than living on the like society or something?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, do you want to answer it?
That's okay. You want to ask too? Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Maybe this one is from YouTube. Going to ask this
Okay.
question.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so from YouTube, we have a question from Jinsi Ismail. So she asked about, based on your study, how many youths involved with the movement concerning environmental issues through lived religion as the approaches? How many youths involved? And does your research also include environmental movements that are present in virtual space?
Virtual space, yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Just writing these down. Okay, good. Should I don't know if I should stand up or what. Yeah, probably should stand up. You can, okay. Good, thank you. Yes. So maybe I'll start with Jesse's question because it's very more specific. Yeah, so because one of the challenges, as I said, about doing secondary data is that we only know what is in the study that we read. So for example, we have a tally of, which I don't actually know the number, unfortunately. Every time it was mentioned there were young people involved, we marked, okay, young people involved. But that means only that the author noticed there were young people involved. Yeah? It doesn't mean that, so it's hard to know how many, but we specifically noted about the numbers of young people groups, and also women's groups. And there's a very high participation mentioned. Some of them obviously taking more maybe feminist or actually focused on youth-led approaches, but some also just in a similar way, including young people or women as an important segment in society that you want to include. I think one aspect that was really interesting, a good example of youth involvement, was the movement in the Aru Islands in Maluku. You know, there was a sugar plantation that was planned to be developed in the Aru Islands, and the actual beginning of the movement to resist this plantation was by young people who were from the Adat community in Aru Islands, and they joined together with a church, and the church actually provided them training on ways of demonstrations, on ways of resisting against the movement. And they actually were the ones who started the movement, which then became a very big movement and ended up having the planning permission revoked from by the sugar plantation company. So yeah, so there's a lot of involvement of young people. Sorry, I just lost my notes. And the other one about virtual spaces. So yes, we did look at online engagement in some of the studies. Like for example, there's a study about the in Bandung, there's a forest in the city. Yeah, I haven't actually been there, so but I know there's a forest in Bandung, and there was a plan to sell the forest to a company to manage the forest, and this was, as you can imagine, very controversial, and a lot of young people in particular supported the movement by using Twitter, by using Instagram, by using a lot of online methods to support the movement. So there's a lot of, I think, and the Aru Islands is another example. So we have a lot of cases where people are using online spaces to try to promote the movement, to get the message out beyond their community. But we didn't actually focus on the virtual space as the location of the movement, because we were focused on, for example, the forest in Bandung more than, I don't know, like online communities. But yeah, in terms of I mean, as we know, in Indonesia, online activism is very used, and in some ways is, you know, people almost think you should, you know, if it's not posted on Instagram, does it happen or not? Yeah, does it exist? So, you know, so do we need to? So I think it's a very powerful tool of mobilization. Yeah. For Mas Firman's question, yes. So I think the both of your examples about the isolation of, you know, so some Adat communities don't want to engage with the wider society because they think that's the only way to protect their system, because these systems are very fragile, they're very vulnerable, they can be easily disrupted by disrupting the economy, by disrupting the ecology. So this is, you know, this is something that has been observed in different cases. In Indonesia, because of the large population and high level of development, there are very few, as opposed to like Brazil or other places where you have communities who actually still are able to live this way. It's very difficult in Indonesia for this to happen. But I think the thing that I wanted to connect with that, as well as to your question about the revival of nature and conservatism in the Christian community or not, it relates to the question by Pak Zain about instrumentalization, because I think it's really important to talk about instrumentalization, because it's something that academics do, something that politicians do. So when I'm talking about how movements are using religion, what I mean is not about how someone is. I'm not trying to make a judgment or an analysis of how religion works in that whole community. It's more looking at how does the social movement try to include religion in order to appeal to people around it. So a nicer way of saying it is that social movements by nature are instrumentalist, right? Because if a social movement, they have a goal. If the goal is they want to stop the forest in Bandung from being privatized, they want to instrumentalize, they want to use any message, any concept, any idea they can use that will help to support their movement. So I think that the question about instrumentalization to some extent is a question about power, is a question about who is using religion and what are they using it for. So I think as from the perspective of social sciences, what we can do is help to explain how religion is being used, and then let society judge if they think this is a good use or a bad use of religion. Because I don't think it's our place as academics to judge this is instrumentalism, this is okay, this is local, this is imposed from outside. It's more for us to say this is what's happening in the society. So the government is using religion in this way, the head of the village is using religion in this way, the social movement is using religion in this way, help to explain what's happening, and then let society judge, is this movement started during what we called New Order, Order Baru time. So between 1990 and 1997, 98 time. So it's only 23, it's not a lot. But what's interesting about it, and I think this is what's very relevant about how things change over time, is that the tactics, the strategies of using religion that are used now were very effective during the New Order time. So, for example, when movements, so for the first resistance against Tanah Lot was during Order Baru, New Order. The first movements to receive recognition of Masyarakat Adat lands were during the New Order. So the idea was that people got the impression, oh, this is working. Yeah, if we use sacred land as a way to support the movement, this is more effective than if we just say we don't like the government, or we don't agree with what the government's doing, or economic development, we're against economic development. But if they said, oh, this is a sacred land that's being taken, sometimes this was more accepted. So I think this influenced a lot of the changes. But as you said, Mas Abdi, the change from local wisdom or local practices to indigenous religions has been happening over the last 10, 15 years, which a lot of people here have written about and documented, such as Mas Anchu rotates about a lot. So some people are now more able to talk about practices as, aliran kepercayaan or as adat, and not have to call it local. But in some cases, it's still, in each area, it's different what language people use. And I think, again, that has to do with what we would say political opportunity structures that exist. So if the concept is useful and beneficial, so now if you can put aliran kepercayaan or indigenous religion on your ID card, then people will use it. If you're not allowed to use it, then people will use something else. So people are adapting to what's kind of acceptable or available, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, it's really interesting. And so the session is started. We have like one or two questions in the YouTube again from Ali Yuna. So hi Jonathan, thank you for your interesting presentation. If I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that your research did not measure the successful factor. If so, how do you measure the lived religion? From my understanding, lived religion should be practices in daily lives. Thank you.
Okay.
And then maybe the next one, my question.
Yeah.
So it's really nice that you brought the tourism topic because it's
Oh, yeah.
related to my question. So like tourism nowadays like has been promoted by the Indonesian government as the developmental priority for economic growth, and of course to prevent the negative impact of massive tourism, they start to create ecotourism or sustainable tourism.
Yeah.
Is being introduced, and as far as I know that some religious communities are quote unquote is being used by tourism to like sell their rituals and practices to others, and and ecotourism and sustainable tourism is introduced to fix that concept. So how do you think the role of ecotourism and sustainable tourism could also motivate creative way of environmental preservation, or maybe will it be significant, or maybe how far tourism could interfere with religious community in terms of environmental preservation?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Maybe one question from the audience, one or two.
So I go with go with these. Great. I'm just looking my. Okay, so yes, for Ali's question on YouTube. Thanks. Yes, so that's true that I'm not wanting to measure this. The study is not to measure the success of movements. To give you an example, this is I recommend you to see, this is a really interesting site. It's called the EJ Atlas, or Environmental Justice Atlas. And it's a map that documents environmental movements for justice all around the world. And as you can see, how many there are in Indonesia, a lot. And in this study, which was set up by academics, but is used by many people to add to, for each movement, they say, for example, this one is about the gold mining in Maluku. They will say the movement is, they will say the movement was successful, unsuccessful, or undetermined. So within social movement studies, there is a strong motivation, a strong influence to try to say what works, what's effective. Yeah, because this is a question everyone wants to know. Is there a secret way you can have a social movement that will be successful? In our study, what we wanted to do was avoid this question, because when you look at it over time, a movement can seem successful and then not successful the next year. You know, they can succeed. For example, tourism is a good example. So, you know, this struggle to protect Tanah Temple, also Benoa Bay in Bali, which is the Benoa Bay Reclamation Project that some CRCS people have written about. People will mobilize to resist it, and they will be successful one year, and then the next year they aren't successful. And so it's a kind of a constant struggle. So I think what we wanted to do was focus on the process, so that we can learn more about how movements work, rather than trying to decide whether we think they are successful or not. So I think that's kind of that's kind of our approach. So then in terms of lived religion, again, we're not trying to say religion should be used this way, should not be used this way. So I want to take away any should, must, might, you know. We're just saying this is what we're seeing that's happening. These are the processes that are being used. And so we can learn from them and understand better about how environmental concepts can be created, how people make new ideas. Yeah. And this is what's useful, I think, for other people to think, okay, if we don't like, let's say everyone has an issue that they don't like. Yeah. In this room, if I ask everyone, what's something about the environment currently that you don't like? Maybe it's something big like climate change. Maybe it's something small like plastic, or, you know, poor air quality. So what kind of change needs to happen to make that different? And what process would we take to get there? What cultural or religious or economic or other things can help us push a process to move in that direction? So I think that's how we're looking at this in the study. And to do with the sustainable tourism, yes. So this is a very controversial area because in some ways tourism it's almost impossible for tourism not to have a negative impact on the environment, right? Because even if you look at the local environment, you can minimize the damage to the local environment by building codes, by limiting numbers of tourists to go to places, but you're still encouraging people to fly a long distance. And as we know, flying is not particularly good for carbon. So the idea of sustainable tourism as a way of trying to balance between economic sustainability and livelihoods of local communities and also care for the environment is something that, you know, people are struggling with how to do it. And I think that's, you know, I know that there are people here working on projects on ecotourism that are led by communities. And I think, you know, some models, a lot of how sustainable something is depends on who is making the decisions. Is it the investors in the program? Is it the government? Is it local communities? If it is the local communities, who in the local community? Is there just one leader who's given a lot of money to support the program, or does it include young people? Does it include women? The more that the local community is driving the process and benefits from it, the more likelihood there is that it will be sustainable, because the local community are the ones who are most impacted by the negative impacts, right? So, you know, if there's damage to the local environment, the local community are the ones who suffer from it. So I think, you know, the more that there is like a, you know, including more different types of local actors, there is maybe a potential for more sustainability, but I don't want to make any judgment about whether it can be, but that's, yeah, potentially.
That's very complicated tourism, because I think tourism, we always try to like balance it out of everything, but yes, of course we cannot, because tourism is all about selling things, and everything is about selling, you know, card selling, marketing and destination practice in our daily lives. So okay, and I would like to give like comments or maybe some experience that relate to this research. Okay, Constancio, please.
Yes.
I'm very thankful for this. And one thing that I want to make comment to one thing that's related to what we have been discussing about religious. So to me, I'm so thankful as well, Jonathan, for using the religious perspective. For me, it's not only just a term of faith, but it's a really utility form of concept. Using religious creativity allows us to see the creativity of the people, responding to the dominant discourse that sometimes do not allow them to express what they are, who they are, what they do. What we have found on people on discourse, like just differentiating this is religion, this is other. For some people, has been actually making people's life difficult, because that sometimes prevent, you know, them doing, expressing, making meanings for them, and so facilitating, like using religious creativity, allows us to see how people are so creative in their religious practices. Local wisdom has been so popularly used, but defining it as something not religious use the way we see how people are so creative with their experiences. And so that's, and combining it with the deep religions of theory, see what religion is. It's not limited to how academics have been defined religion. Helps us a lot also to, to really think about what religion is. And so, again, so thankful, and I think this is from being involved or being much Jonathan's partner in this work, is that religious activity is one way. I have found it that religious activity is one way of bridging those conflicting terms and knowledges that have been used sometimes politically and socially as a way of marginalizing others. It allows us to see those peoples in the fields, on the grassroots, living their life peacefully, using different terms, but they share something meaningful, like Nyadran. Nyadran is a practice of many religious followers, in which those who are practicing that, they see how this, how their social values being exercised, crossing religious lines. So yeah, I think it is what I would emphasize and learn a lot from offering the theory of religious creativity that would give us, like a very good bridge to talk to the anthropologists, the sociologists, environmentalists, from which you can see how religious people working on the environment, as people working on the environments, to come together for this. People with respect have done that. We academy understand the way we are seeing the big picture, in the big picture, we see that. So very much thankful to this work, Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Anju, for your comments. So I think before we end this forum, maybe Jonathan, if you have some like final statement.
Oh, okay. No other questions.
No other questions?
Are you sure? I was hoping for some good criticism, but I haven't got enough yet. No? All right. Okay. Please, that those of you who are oh, sorry, I'll stop kicking my water bottle now. I know those of you who are here a lot. Also, you can contact me online also, but you're here, so maybe we can have more conversations about this as I'm here. I'm hope to be here for at least another year, because I really value your own research, your own insight, your own experience. That is what I had tried to learn from in this study, and I think in a lot of ways it's not right yet. So I need to keep talking and thinking. Mas Adam and I had hundreds of hours sitting in Matokopi usually or somewhere, just looking at the data, thinking about it, talking about it. So I hope we can have more opportunities to get your own perspective. And I think to add, I think that the reason why when I read the concept of religious creativity, as you know, it's written by a Western scholar, and a lot of times these concepts are not always very relevant to what happens in, outside of like the US or UK context. When I read about it, I thought directly about Mas Anju's paper about being Muslim in animistic ways. So I started to think, oh, this is interesting. How do we want to talk about this tension between Adat practices and Islam? Do we want to talk about it, start from a position of there is a divide, there is a barrier. We have decided this is Muslim, this is not Muslim. And this is obviously important for all communities. And this is the job of religious leaders, of religious followers, to decide what their religion is. It's not my job to say what people's religion is or isn't. But from the perspective of as academics, as people who want to understand how religion works in society, it's very important, I think, that we don't just start with the division. We don't just start with the conflict, but we also look at where people can find creative ways to make a connection, creative ways to not just, to make a new idea. And I think I really learned about that from my conversations with Masanchu, from my conversations with a lot of the students here and alumni here, is you have creative ways to try to make connections, to try to bridge the artificial barriers that are put up between categories. So I look forward to having more opportunities for us to do this together and hopefully learn more from each other. So thank you to all of you.
So, yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. Big applause for Jonathan. So thanks so much for all of your participations. We really appreciate that. And we are going to see you on the next Wednesday forum.
Oh,
Okay, before we have gifts for Jonathan.
oh yeah. Oh, nice. Okay. Okay.
Do you like it?
Oh, look at this. Can I just say also, this is an amazing poster. Have you guys seen this poster? Isn't it? So, Masabdi told me when he said, "Oh, I have to draw something about lived eco-religion. How am I going to do it?" I think he did it. Yeah, yeah. Amazing. Thank you. Thanks.
So we shake hands.
Yes.
You
Wait,
look
gimana? Oh, maaf. Di sini? Oh ya. Sini?
No one taking picture. We don't need no one
We're
taking-
just pretending. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.